huge irony in talking about digitization and livelihoods in the context of COVID. And the irony is this: until March, I think the world was preoccupied with the big question of how do we preserve jobs in an environment where technology was taking over as a significant factor of production. And what happens to the future of work when artificial intelligence does all the things that we do? What does it mean for manufacturing for countries like India that are still in the process of moving their structural transformation? And then comes the pandemic, which sort of turns everything that we know on its head. And in that process, I think has completely transformed our debate on the relationship between technology and jobs, where now we are looking at what technology can do to, in fact, create ways in which workers and employers can connect with each other. And I think we saw a lot of this innovation in the period of the lockdown, and I think some of that innovation is continuing post, where local retailers, as the globe had to retreat into their homes, and interaction in the normal course of things was curtailed. Suddenly, technology became such an important means by which your basic needs could be fulfilled in ways that one had never imagined before. So even in India, where for the longest time, many gig economy platforms were not allowed to use their platforms for sort of non-essential services, you suddenly saw the the small retailers looking for innovative ways, sometimes as rudimentary as WhatsApps, and over time in much more sophisticated ways, now with Amazon Local and other examples, trying to come together in this way. I think that it's important, though, as we celebrate this potential, also to be a little cautious of what this actually means for the relationship between these large sort of enterprises, our Amazons and Walmarts that are now serving this role, and what it means for the smaller player. And ultimately, because we're talking about jobs and the workers, what it means for workers. I think we'll explore some of these in the course of our conversation, but it's important to be always cautious of the downsides of these moments of transition. The second important thing that I think technology is doing, we've seen reports, you talked in your question about migrant workers, people who lost their jobs going back home, and we've seen a lot of reports of district administration now trying to create the equivalent of employment exchanges, where through digital platforms, skill mapping is being done and potential employers and employees are being connected with each other. Again, I think this has real potential, simply because one of the big challenges in skilling in India has been that skilling has always been very much supply side, and not enough interface has happened on the demand side, both between the employer and the employee. And these efforts could be the starting point for creating that framework, and potentially improving our capability at doing better skilling in an ecosystem where skilling has been quite limited. So I think these are the two things I'd like to highlight about technology and livelihoods. The gig economy has filled a vacuum as society is reorganizing itself, and regular interactions are becoming much more limited, and the gig economy has created ways in which the economy can continue to function, but of course it brings to bear important questions about new monopsonies that are being created. And at the same time, government is being able to use these platforms as ways of creating employment exchanges, understanding skilling, and doing better demand mapping, which may help in strengthen our ecosystem for jobs going forward. So I think in discussions on technology and delivery mechanisms, we often end up conflating the enabling context of technology with the magic bullet answer that we are seeking. And we should be very cautious of this. Technology enables as much as your policy ecosystem allows it to enable. It is not going to substitute for the critical underlying policy ecosystem that is necessary to be in place in order for the economy to function. It can certainly bridge gaps and accelerate momentum, but it's not going to be your answer. And it's important for us to state that upfront, because I think that in policy debates in India, we tend tend to conflate the two, and we are looking to technology as the great leap forward that will help us undo and overcome all the other ecosystem challenges that we confront. So when it comes, for example, to access to finance for small micro enterprises, as you talked about, we need to look much beyond technology. Actually, fintech is an enabler, but we have to look at the larger policy environment of the banking system, access to credit, the risk appetite within the banking system, which has to do with a lot of other factors, and the ability of small and micro enterprises to deal with the unpredictabilities that they are embedded in, the unpredictabilities of payments, the unpredictabilities of demand and supply shocks. Think about the last 5 years. The MSMEs have had to deal with, from demonetization to COVID, a range of supply shocks that have completely transformed the context in which they are working, right? And the banking system has its own sets of weaknesses that have come to bear in the last few years. So what is technology going to do? Technology can help overcome some things, but it's not going to address these fundamental underlying conditions. And I think the focus should be on that. Having said that, of course, the enabling context of technology should not be undermined. And I think that even simple things like the fact that because of GST, with all its limitations, there is now at least a database into which many of our, not all, but many of our micro enterprises, if not the micro enterprises, have come on, have entered into the system. That certainly helps us in terms of being able to reach out to small enterprises and bridging the gap of information and bridging the gap of access. And then, of course, overlaying it, the costs of access, the costs for banks to access and provide credit using fintech technologies, the cost reduction substantively help, the layering on of technology helps. So all of this enables faster acceleration, but it will not address the fundamental ecosystem challenges that need to be resolved first. So a few things, let me be very clear. I do recognize that the regulatory environment in which the framework of labor capital relationships have been or set up in India is filled with what Manish Sabharwal calls regulatory cholesterol that fundamentally undermines and creates conditions that can be constraining for capital. However, any debate about labor laws that seeks to start as its starting point undermining workers' rights will never effectively succeed. And more importantly, in a democracy, will actually create deep social problems. I think the one thing that India must remember is that we have a unique context in which we have labor laws that neither support labor nor support capital. And we have to reframe the debate on labor laws in the context of the reality that we need to protect workers' rights. And the pandemic actually, I believe, has really brought that out in sharp relief. The fact that most of India's workers do not have enough saving or social protection to be able to manage even a week without work. The fact that most of our workers had to go undertake long and arduous journeys home because they were devoid of any purpose of being in cities with no social security should actually serve as a reminder of how precarious labor rights actually are. And any attempt at addressing this challenge, both of ensuring that capital can flourish and at the same time as protecting labor without addressing the reality of labor rights, is, in my opinion, deeply flawed. So I'm not in favor of labor reforms that doesn't actually rebalance these realities. But having said that, I think the big challenge for India is really about rethinking and reframing how it can simplify and reform its labor laws in the context of all of these realities and manage this jugalbandi of protecting rights and enabling capital. And in that context, I think the gig economy creates a new challenge for us. It creates a new challenge for us in the following way, that the informal worker actually needs to be redefined, because the gig economy worker is considered, I think, as self-employed, but in effect is actually an informal worker. And the kinds of protection that they require, therefore, need to be very much part of the debate. I believe the Social Security Code actually acknowledges the presence of gig workers, but it needs to be engaged with, it needs to engage engage with what this means a lot more. And I also think that we need to recognize with the gig economy that the dynamic of labor capital relations going forward are going to look very different, simply because the old structure of the factory, where labor used to organize itself, it no longer exists. I mean, most people who are employed by Ola engage with their employer through a computer. They don't actually engage with their employer physically through a work site, which builds a certain context in which these relationships function. So how capital organizes itself in this new gig economy, how labor chooses to engage and organize, and what should the role of the state be that creates a regulatory framework for engagement is, I think, a question that still is evolving. We need to understand this better and engage in conversations with people like you a lot more to be able to build a frame for what effective social protection and effective labor rights mean in this changing context. So more than a rethink or restructuring of the urban social protection system, I think the starting point has to be the actual creation of an urban social protection system. I think one of the big limitations, gig economy or not, in the Indian framing of social protection is that we have, with all its flaws and limitations, at least some semblance of a social protection network that meets the needs of the most vulnerable, poorest populations. But we do not have a good enough social security system that aligns itself to the more vulnerable population. I think, the migrant crises, as it's now being referred to, that we saw in the early part of the law over these last 3 months, in fact, is a good example of precisely this, that these are workers, these are people who are wage earners. But our social protection system is not designed in a way that can, in fact, provide them the right kind of social safety nets. And how we design that will have to be very agile and very mobile, because these are also mobile workers. So the need for introducing what we call in, people who work on social protection call portability, i.e. I can take my benefits and with me no matter where I am, is a very critical element of this. But the second part of this, and specifically I think for gig workers, is that, I don't think that we have cracked the nut of how do you build a contributory social insurance system in which both the worker and the state or employer, but more the worker and the state, has a interaction. I mean, we have the EPFO, which has its own sets of problems, but more for the informal worker, which is really the gig worker. There are a whole host of schemes that government announces periodically that are these contributory social pensions and so on. But the participation is very, very low. And part of the reason why the participation is low is because these haven't been designed right, and the expectation of the nature of contribution, etc. But another important issue is around, financial knowledge or financial understanding, and the ability of workers to actually think long term about planning of their financial needs. And this is a completely different ball game. In higher incomes, the insurance officer kind of does that role for all these. In banks play that role. But when you're talking at scale with workers that have relatively limited engagement with the banks, etc., how does one actually do this? So how does one build financial awareness, financial education, and make it relevant for people for whom really my earnings are actually going to be spent tomorrow? So how do I think about savings in that context? And then how do I think about longer term financial benefits and insurance in that context? So I think we need a lot more innovation. And this is again where fintech and financial companies can play an important role in financial innovation, where we're both designing products. And I think a lot of the innovation so far has been on the design of the product, but also building an outreach mechanism to bring people in. I mean, and it's not just India. I remember I'd gone to Philadelphia last year for a conference, and after our conference dinner, we got into an Uber car, and somebody was talking, the discussion amongst all of us in the car was about health insurance in the US, and the Uber driver basically said, I'm not interested in my savings, in my salary getting cut off for insurance. I mean, I want my money in my pocket, and let me be the person to make those choices. So I think we also need to much better understand across all levels of income, how do people perceive their financial needs? How do people make financial decisions? It's a very, very fast, rapidly changing world. We used to talk about millennials. I'm far away from that world, but now there are all sorts of generation, youngers, whatever they call it. And I think people's approach to work, even amongst higher income groups, are very, very different. I mean, I came in my generation, we were probably the first that saw careers not as long-term places where you sat in one place for 30 years. But I'm finding in the younger generation, it doesn't have loyalty to the job. They have loyalty to the ideas. They have loyalty to the work. And so they'll move until they find a place where they are happy. And if they're not, they move. So, you don't come into a job thinking I'm going to be here for those pensions. You think about your job very differently, and how you gain satisfaction is calibrated differently for different kinds of people. And therefore, I think we need a lot more understanding amongst all income brackets: first generation earners, third generation earners, people in the top income deciles, to really figure out what's the best way. So there's a role for the state, and there's a role for the employer, and there is a role for the fintech innovator, who really needs to think outside of the box and better understand demand today.